we can start, Professor Mcgill, and I'm gonna ask permission for the recording, Anne, and the participant, if you agree. I want to welcome all of you to the launching of the Dialogues on Indigenous Peoples Territories, Stories of Resilience. I know many people are connecting from different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hi, Patricia, and to all of you. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you, all of you, as part of this initiative. And Luisa Castaneda-Quintana, the coordinator of the dialogues and the moderator of today's session. It is my pleasure to be here with you in this first dialogue with Nuorgam to talk about Indigenous peoples and global challenges. Before I start, I would like to ask you, as you might know, to turn off your microphone, and you are invited to have your cameras on. We will have around 50 minutes dialogue with our special guest, and after that we will have an open session for questions from the participants, from all of you. With this in mind, I will now open the event with some welcoming remarks from the co-sponsor of the dialogues for this. We have two very esteemed speakers. To begin with, we have Professor Frederick Mcgill, who is the coordinator of the Mcgill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. Professor Mcgill, please take the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Luisa. And I just want to first underscore how delighted we are to, help sponsor the event, and most grateful to you, Luisa, for the initiative. And, this is how we think of the center as a place, as a kind of incubator for its members' initiatives. And we're particularly glad when the initiative comes from doctoral students. I know there's quite a lot of participants. I'll keep this short. One of the wonders of Zoom is we can have actually quite large audiences, and this enables conversations that maybe in another era might not have been possible. So welcome to all of you, whatever time zone you may be on. And I see that South Australia is included among the many regions. So truly a global conversation, and I think the inspiration behind this event was a desire to bridge conversations that exist sometimes in relative isolation from each other. We have a domestic Canadian conversation on Indigenous rights, and there are Australian and American and South American conversations. And then there are conversations going on in Geneva that have, a much more kind of supranational tonality to them, and we wanted to make sure that everyone was talking to everyone. So that's why the center is really happy to launch these dialogues in the spirit of exchanging views and of conversing and of respect for Indigenous legal traditions and their diversity and their resilience. Thanks also to the Indigenous Law Association of Mcgill, who has participated in this initiative. And I wanted to acknowledge and the presence and thank Nuorgam, a lawyer and chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues, whose leadership has really led to, I think, significant advances on Indigenous peoples' rights worldwide. So thank you very much, Anne, for being with us. Luisa.
Thank you, Professor Mcgill, and thank you for acknowledging the relevance of these dialogues and the importance for the advancement of Indigenous people rights. Next, we have Simone Philotrous, who is the co-president of the Indigenous Law Association of Mcgill University. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luisa. Kwe aweti Simon Heatsi Wendat Endi Ashkenania Eves. So hello everyone, my name is Simon and I am a proud Yuron Wendat from Wendake, which is located very close to Quebec City. And I hope you're all doing great wherever you are right now in the world. And I am a fourth-year law student here at Mcgill University. And as Luisa said, I act as the co-president of the Indigenous Law Association here at Mcgill, also known as ILADA. Let me say a few words on land acknowledgement. So before every event of ILADA, we take a moment to remind ourselves that we stand, and Mcgill stands on unceded indigenous lands on which the Anishinaabe and the Kanakahanka nation have long been recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. However, given the current remote context, we may be dispersed all over the province, the country, or even the world. So let's acknowledge the historical practices of the colonial empires to unilaterally take indigenous lands away from them. Here in Canada, the British Crown and now the Canadian Crown has asserted its authority on indigenous lands based on all sorts of colonial doctrines. So let's honor, recognize, and respect these sovereign indigenous nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which states like Canada stand today. So that being said, what is the Indigenous Association and why are we co-hosting such an event? So we are a student-led group that advocates for greater awareness of Indigenous legal, political, and social issues. And we pursue our mission by creating healthy and respectful spaces of discussion and reflections. And these spaces take many forms, like on our social media platform, on our Indigenous law journal, Rooted, or in the form of events like the series of dialogues we are co-launching right now. And the idea here is to spark meaningful conversations on Indigenous peoples, their realities, endeavors, and positive contributions to the world, while involving a broad audience from students to scholars to the larger public. And one major discussion that had to be held is on the impact of global issues on Indigenous peoples. And that is the topic of our first dialogue. And indeed, the world we live in is driven by forces of centralization and uniformization, which leaves little room for dissent and difference. And that is exactly what Indigenous peoples embody on a global scale, that is dissent and difference. And yet Indigenous peoples have much to offer to the Western societies. So I'll stop here and turn the floor back to you, Luisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you for supporting this initiative and for giving these important opening remarks. Now we are moving to the introduction of our special guest, Ms. Anne Nuorgam. Anne Nuorgam is a long-term Sami politician and a lawyer who holds a Master of Law degree and is currently a PhD student at the University of Lapland. She has been member of the Sami Parliament of Finland since 2000, and she has been working on reconciliation issues and now works at the head of the Sami Council Human Rights Unit. Mr. Nuorgam is the chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, elected in 2009, and is currently conducting her second mandate. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to have you here in the launching of the dialogues on Indigenous peoples, and also have the opportunity to know more about you, your views of the states of Indigenous peoples, and also know about the work you have done. Thank you, Anne, and welcome. Good afternoon for you. How are you today, Anne?
Good afternoon and good morning to you. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm fine here on this in northern Finland, where I'm currently in Sámi. And I'd like to thank for you, Luisa, personally, and then of course the Student Association and Mcgill University for this invitation. And as a matter of fact, I visited your university, was it year 91, by the invitation of one of the professors of anthropology. We had a large Sami student group visiting you, and they learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada in that, during that journey. So I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, thank you. And well, I hope we can repeat this kind of experiences that are very enriching for sure. And I would like to start this dialogue with you, and because it's about stories of resilience of Indigenous peoples, and storytelling is very important for Indigenous people, and it's the way they pass down their knowledge, their language, their traditions to the youngest generation, and elders and women have a big responsibility on that. And also, I believe that we all have stories or drivers that motivate us to be where we are now and what we do now, right? So I would like to start with a personal question for you. I would like to hear about you and your stories. And when was the moment that you understood that you were an Indigenous person and a member of the Sami people? And how did you realize that?
I have been brought up in a Sami society, and I learned Finnish language when I was 6, went to the boarding school, and at that time, so I was 1 year in a boarding school, and we were lucky that the legislation here in Finland changed so that the boarding schools were, some of them were transferred into those schools where the municipality organized us daily tax rights to the school. And my school was about 32 kilometers away from my home place. So every day that back and forth, but it was just 1 year. And so Sami, I have been all my life brought up to the Sami cultures, habits, and so on, traditions, and then learned Finnish and the Finnish school system and so on. But then when did I realize that I was Indigenous? We had the headquarters of the Sami Council in our home village in Otsioka in Finland. And the Sami Council was part of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, was it WCIP, which I imagine the headquarters was in Canada before it ended its work. So we had, in our home village, we had Indigenous peoples coming to visit us since 70s. So we knew about being Indigenous and what that means already early in the school. But my first time when I went to the Indigenous gathering was 1983, when I hosted Indigenous peoples all around the world in one of the Sami conferences. So I guess then we were taught at that time that what means to be Indigenous, what is the global Indigenous movement, and what are Indigenous rights and how they differ from minorities and so on.
And when you discovered that that you were the Indigenous Sami and Indigenous woman, I guess that you were learning about the culture, but at the same time you were like knowing about the challenges that you people were facing by the time. So do you think that those challenges that you notice in your community or when you gather of Indigenous peoples there make you reflect, as you say, that you knew the movement and the importance of Indigenous people rights? So that make you reflect on the importance of continue advancing Indigenous people rights, and that was what triggered your interest in advocating for Indigenous people rights and motivate you to become an Indigenous leader?
It's back in those days in 80s, then among the Sami, it was when we look at the rights question, it was about the linguistic rights, and it was about possibility to be taught in the Sami language and also at that time, we didn't have kindergartens or daycare in my home village. And then that was the issue at that time, which we fought for, that we get a daycare in the Sami language, because most of the people living in our village were Sami, and but we had to put our kids into the Finnish daycare and Finnish schools. So that was at that time the most the issue we were discussing. And then later came the land rights and so on. But it started to improving the everyday life of the people, and those land rights, and they were a little bit further away. They were not discussed that much. And when first time I realized, of course, because of the guests coming from internationally to our region and speaking about the problems which were common for us all, it was that I spent a year as an exchange student in close to Buffalo, in New York State, and in one of the families I lived with was from a Native family, and they told me about that ongoing situation, what happened in the 70s, beginning of 80s, and then the fights with the natives, with the government in the United States. And there, first time I realized about the violence, and that it exists because we live in a peaceful part of the world. So those were my first encounters to the global indigenous rights movement.
And so you say that you started like acknowledging that there was a lack of respect of the Sami people's rights to language, and to start like by drop this idea of just speaking the mainstream language of the Finnish society. And I guess after that you became aware of the challenges, and you start like working on behalf of your people. And this is what somehow has shaped the person you are now. And to continue talking a bit of the challenges of the Sami people, like I imagine now there are more challenges, and also taking into account that you live in the Arctic, that is an area that is highly impacted by climate change, and you have been fighting for some years for the Sami fishing rights. So what are the challenges that the Sami people facing now? Are they very different from the past years when you started your work as an indigenous leader?
First of all, we Sami, we live in 4 different countries, in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and also in Russia. And most of our Sami population live in Norway, and it's about 100,000, 70 to 100,000. We don't know the exact number. In Sweden, about 25,000. In Finland, about 10,000, and in Russia, about 2,000-3,000. So there is a big difference in number. And when I have been teaching Sami rights, Sami law, and in a nutshell, it could be stated that when you look at because in all these countries, there is different legislation, and we have a constitutional recognition of Sami people in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And in Sweden, Sami are recognized as a people. So it's the highest constitutional recognition. In Finland, Sami are recognized as indigenous people, and with their own self-governance autonomy. We have an autonomy, designated autonomous area. And in Norway, Sami people are recognized as population in the Norwegian constitution. But then, even though the recognition is lowest in all these Nordic countries, when you look at the practical level, the Sami rights, they are organized best in Norway. And it could be stated that in Norway, in northern part of Norway, in Finnmark region, the Sami land rights are recognized. In Sweden, the Sami reindeer herding rights are recognized, and they have Sami parliament has the reindeer herding governance also in its own hands. So there the decision making is in the Sami hands. And in Finland, it can be stated that our language rights and FPIC are at its best level, because in the Finnish legislation, Act on Sami Parliament, the government and official official parts, official officers, or how do you say that, governance, they have duty to negotiate with the Sami parliament, but there is no duty to have consent, but close to the consent. So we have in Finland, the FPIC is procedural right when it comes to the Sami. And if those procedural processes are not implemented according to the legislation, then the decisions are void by the officials. So that's when it comes to the in these Nordic countries. But when you look at the challenges, I just told the best practices, the challenges, then the land rights in Finland almost not existing. We have very good rights to use. We have usufruct rights, but not the ownership rights. And in Sweden, FPIC is it's not there yet. There is no FPIC legislation. And in Norway, there are, it depends on which part of Norway you come from, but FPIC is also missing in some parts of the legislation. So those are the, and in Russia, there are several problems, and you just name it, list them. So that's what is the reality.
It came to my mind with what you just said about like governance and how the Sami people's law interact also with the government. And for instance, in Finland, you mentioned that you are part of the parliament. So how is this relationship? Like, because you have your own laws that are based on their cosmovision, on your relation with land. And you just also mentioned that there are like a very strong set of rights, but the rights are not respected by the government and companies. So how is their relation between the Sami parliament and the government when it comes to ask for the enforcement of those rights?
It is because for example, the FPIC, the duty to negotiate, there is an act and on that one, so that it means that we have very strong protection if the government doesn't follow the legislation. But then, for example, when you look at, for example, mining in our Sami region, we don't have any mines because we have such a strong protection, legal protection, duty to negotiate. And but of course, there are mining companies trying to come to our region, but they have so far failed. And they have reserved some locations, and we are now currently those issues are in court to be. And for example, Sami parliament has right to make a complaint to the court if the decision or if the FPIC is legislation is not followed, and we have done that for several cases. And of course, we have possibility to complain, also make complaints if Sami culture is not respected, taken into account in those decisions. And so far, we have won quite many of the cases, more than 1,200,000 cases. So at the moment, we don't have any mines, but let's hope that it goes. But then in the policy, it's different in Sweden and in Norway, because in Norway there are mines all over the Sami region, as well as there are in Sweden, and we see that there is a missing legislation concerning FPIC in those two countries, so that there are more cases going into court on those ones. And you asked about the fishing rights case, which I've been involved. And here in Finland, because as I mentioned, we don't have land rights, and we just have usufruct rights. And the government legislates quite strictly our usufruct rights. For example, we cannot fish whenever we want to, but it's there is an agreement from my home river. I come from the salmon fishing Sami background, and I have been brought up to fish. And then therefore there was the governments of Norway and Finland, because I live on the border of Norway and Finland. There is a salmon river called Piatno. There is an agreement between the government of Finland and Norway about regulation to regulate the salmon fishing. And they have regulated the salmon fishing. For example, last year, there was a total salmon fishing ban, so we could not fish. But of course, I fished illegally. But before that, there was a regulation that on one of rivers there that we had to fight for the buying licenses together with tourists. We were grouped in the same fishing license buyers as tourists. So what we did, 4 of us, 3 women and 1 minor, we announced ourselves to the police and told that we are fishing illegally. So this went to this is a criminal case, and it went to the first instance where we won, and the court stated that we have right to fish because it's our traditional way of living as Sami. And now it's in the Supreme Court, and we are waiting to have the decision in the future, in a month or so, to see what is the if we Sami people have the right to practice our own culture in the form of fishing without license.
It's been quite a long journey trying to get back your rights, and I can see you great work on this, and as an Indigenous woman, as a Sami person, and I wanted to, because you have told us about the Sami people, and we are kind of moving, to the global challenges, and because what I can see, like what the Sami people is experiencing is also a part of a global problematic in other regions where Indigenous people live. So when you say, like, as a woman, as a lawyer, as a Sami person, you have, like, based on your leadership, you have, like, promote the recognition and the respect of the people's rights. But you are a great example of that as a woman. But even though Indigenous women have a great role in their communities, because they are the bearers of knowledge, they are providers of food, of knowledge, of traditions, they pass down this knowledge to the youngest generation. But even though they have this key role in their communities, so I'm not an Indigenous person, but some Indigenous women also, they have claimed that they sometimes do not have the participation in decision-making processes. I'm not talking about within their people or organization, but, like, outside also of the organization. So in this regard, because you are in a position of, like, high relevance at a global level, you are the chair of the Permanent Forum Indigenous People. So I would like to know how has been your experience as an Indigenous woman in these positions, but also what do you think needs to be done to ensure the participation of Indigenous women in decision-making processes?
Thank you. And going back to the previous one, it was strategic litigation, what we did. And this is what us 3 women, we decided to do because of and going to the criminal court, because the punishment is just fine. So we can endure getting fines economically. But then this is one of the things what women do in quite many of the societies. They take responsibility of changing the legislations, changing the practices and to working for the community. And here, when it comes to the, when you ask your question as a Indigenous women and leader, I don't really feel like being Indigenous leader. I just feel it like I'm an individual woman who is trying to have our rights recognized and work for that. It's not the, then this is the end goal. And for that, I think it's really important to, when we start from the basics, to get Indigenous women and girls to the positions, so that at least half are Indigenous women in the positions. And it's extremely important to guarantee education for women as well. So through education, it is women get more possibilities. And when we look at all the wars and so on, it's very rare that there are women leaders. Look at nowadays the situation in Ukraine, in Russia. How many women there are in the top positions? Sorry, not talking about the topic, but still it is. And therefore, and one of the really important discussion issues is the violence in our societies. And that is something that women speak about loudly. And I'm not sure how we can get also the male to speak about the violence in our societies. I don't know the answer to that. And therefore we need more discussion about also the injustices within our own societies. And it's in many cases, it's women who dare to bring those to the agenda of the different meetings. And for example, when we look at the meetings of the Permanent Forum, we have been working for the past 5-6 years with this self-determination, land rights, and so on and so on. And I think it's at one point there, this should be one of the topics, which is one priority topics of the Permanent Forum, is that violence in our societies. But I don't know if I answered to your question correctly. I don't know. It is something which needs to be taken to the agenda again and again.
I don't think there is like a right answer about this. It's about how we construct together to advance in to make sure like Indigenous women and women in general are included in decision-making processes. I'm just gonna jump to a question that I have for later, but you talk about violence. And this is a topic that I've been very interested in, and it's like the criminalization and violence against Indigenous people. And last year, the 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum, the discussion, the theme was about SDG 16. So you talk about like the large amount of cases of violence within against Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women too, no? So we see the report of Global Witness and say that in 2020, 5 out of 7 human rights, environmental human rights defenders killed were Indigenous people. But in Latin America, 7 out of the 15 women that were environmental human rights defenders were Indigenous women. But behind this, there is a serious problematic because there is violence, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, by violence against Indigenous women that is not documented. And even though the amount of people who have been, Indigenous people have been killed, of the leaders that have been killed in general, there are more cases. Usually these NGO claims that they don't have, they haven't documented all the cases. So, but it's even worse when it comes with violence against Indigenous women, because there is nothing about it. And I mean, and in the Permanent Forum, there was part of the the discussion. So when we talk about the criminalization, the people are being depicted as criminals and they are like put in jails. What do you think how do you think this issue should be addressed, and what are the responsibilities of states and universities, organizations in order to overcome this phenomenon?
It's a difficult question. And I think it's, first of all, it's the responsibility of the states, member states, to legislate the issue and organize the protection. And then on the other hand, it is the responsibility of the member states to legislate the working environment of different enterprises. And that's one of the ways to solve the issue. But of course, it is extremely important that these issues are discussed in the highest possible level, for example, at the UN. And therefore, the resolutions on environmental human rights defenders, they are important when they were given first time in human rights at the Human Rights Council. And as I understood, that is going to be renewed now. And first of all, by this concept of human rights defender, Indigenous peoples first time were, how do you say, they got the attention of the world to the violence which Indigenous peoples encounter, came to the larger knowledge of the human rights world. And then when you look at nowadays the situation, it's there have been built some kind of protection mechanisms, for example, within the UN, the EU, European Union, and so on, which and some Indigenous peoples use those. But then I think that this issue should be discussed more thoroughly. And one of the issues, one of the ways how it could be discussed, because I come from a Nordic country, you are in Canada, wealthy country, and we have all that development funding, a huge amount of that. And through the development funding, that issue could be addressed by regulating the development funding to the developing countries in a way that, for example, special attention should be paid to the Indigenous peoples or Indigenous human rights defenders. I don't know how to do that, but by the end of the day, it's always money which talks at the UN, or of course the politics, but the money, how you regulate things. And that could be used as one of the ways to do it. But this is a serious issue, and we encountered, I was a member of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and we were very aware that when we funded Indigenous peoples to the different UN meetings, especially to the treaty bodies, in some of those grantees who were given the grants, some were killed, and some encountered violence, and some had to become refugees because of going to the UN, to the treaty bodies, to tell to the world that what kind of violence they had encountered and so on. And when being a member of that voluntary fund, we had to face our responsibility of the grant, giving a grant, that what kind of consequences it would lead. And therefore it is, we have addressed this issue in quite many of the permanent forum reports, speeches, and so on, and asking for member states to take this issue seriously and to build better protection to Indigenous peoples, and of course regulating the enterprises. And at the moment we have in Geneva there is a process of drafting a convention on business and human rights. And there are very few indigenous peoples participating in that process. And that's something that could be used in this work. So I wish that more indigenous peoples start participating in that one.
You were talking about like the funding and how that could be a way to address and to give them like direct funding to the human rights defenders. So it came to my mind about that in the Glasgow 26, COP26 in Glasgow, governments and some organizations pledged 1.7 billion to go directly to indigenous people's organizations. I don't know how it's gonna work. I'm not following that, but I mean, even though the amount is not that big considering the contribution that indigenous peoples do to protect biodiversity, but since we know that some of the causes of criminalization is the lack of land tenure rights. So how do you think, I mean, it could be a positive like initiative to start like giving money directly to indigenous organizations and not to the states and other stakeholders. So what do you think about it, and how do you think this should work, and how it's gonna help you to indigenous people to advance in the land tenure rights?
First of all, when we look at these land tenure rights, they are in most of the cases regulated nationally, and in those member states which have ratified the ILO Convention 169, there the situation is a little bit better, because there the indigenous peoples can directly report to the ILO these mechanisms, but it is, first of all, before recognition of the land tenure rights, there needs to be recognition of indigenous peoples. And when we look at the world member states, for example, at the moment within the United Nations, we are trying to produce a map of indigenous peoples where they live. But we have seen that some member states are not so happy on publishing this kind of map, because they have not recognized indigenous peoples in their sovereign regions. So that I would say that, first of all, we still have to continue to help the member states to recognize indigenous peoples in their territories that they are. And we have now within the Permanent Forum, we have seen some development. We have seen that more and more African member states are recognizing indigenous peoples in their regions. For example, in Latin America, we have the organization called PHILAC, which consists of member states and indigenous peoples. And we are trying to get a similar kind of body to be established both in Africa and in Asia. And in Africa, the discussions have developed longer, so that we hope to see in some future that this similar kind of body is established. And we know that there is a little bit different definition for indigenous peoples in Africa that in the rest of the world, but still it's development. There is development, and we have also seen that there are more member states contacting our DESA, our office, and asking for help to develop national action plans for indigenous peoples to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we have seen that as a positive development. And so far we have been involved in that one in Namibia, and we hope to see that to start working with other member states in southern part of Africa.
That is a very critical point, and because we have this narrative that indigenous people live in more than 90 countries, but when we map all these countries, and there was an exercise we did at FAO, we notice that they are not legally recognized in many of these. I remember there were like 38 countries who only legally recognize indigenous peoples among the more than like, it was like 98 countries. But another issue is because, I mean, there are, especially in African nations, as you mentioned, countries where indigenous people are not recognized within the borders. They don't recognize the existence, as you said. But what about with these countries when they say that all people there are indigenous peoples? Because that creates another challenge in order to the realization of the dedicated legal framework on indigenous people. So what is your view about it? And I mean, I guess it's about the continued dialogue that you are like promoting from the UN Permanent Forum, but like I would like to hear your insights about it.
Yes, that is, we have heard that, but I'm optimist hearing that in less and less in cases. But of course, we have this the enhanced participation process at the United Nations, and in World Congress of the of Indigenous Peoples 2014, the General Assembly decided about this enhanced process, and it means that Indigenous peoples should be able to represent themselves at the UN at the highest level, General Assembly. That's the request from Indigenous peoples. But then there have been going on negotiations for the past 8 years now on which level the Indigenous peoples' participation is possible, and there annually or there has been reports from the President of the General Assembly how it could be organized, what are the obstacles, and so on. And now this discussion is also the Human Rights Council has in its last resolution concerning Indigenous peoples from last September decided to hold a 4-day workshop on how Indigenous peoples could participate in the at the Human Rights Council. And the problem with Indigenous participation is that Indigenous peoples can participate through NGOs, non-governmental organizations, but not as their own governance entities, their own representative bodies, so that they have to have NGOs to establish and apply status through NGO committee, ECOSOC status. But then how that's one of the processes at the moment at the United Nations. So we try to get a representation for our own institutions. In the Sami case, it's the Sami parliaments, and in Canadian case, it's the tribal councils and so on. But then the question about Africa and Asia, we have seen a good example where you, Luisa, were also involved, was that UN Food System Summit, where there was established a coalition for Indigenous people's food systems. And through that work, we got also some Asian countries interested in working with Indigenous peoples, because at the moment, Indigenous people's food systems are seen as an example to review the food systems of the world and to see how they could, for example, in the Sami case, we have how we are in the climate change situation, coping with the climate change and using still the nature in a sustainable way. But then the question how to cope with those member states, it is discussions, good examples, more information, and so on and so on. And it's of course we have to rely on those member states who speak for us, because by the end of the day, they are the ones who negotiate about the status of Indigenous peoples in the intergovernmental negotiations. So, and the answer is in these countries where we live, let's get more Indigenous to the governmental structures, so they negotiate on behalf of the member states, and then to convince the other member states that we don't threaten the sovereignty of each country.
In this response, you talk about different things. You talk about like participation, FPIC, rights, and also climate change, and how indigenous people food systems are contributing to tackle this global issue through their variety of food systems. And there is something that is concerning also like now indigenous peoples, and is because it's related to climate change, to conservation, to food system, to their territory, to everything. No, it's like the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that calls to protect 30% of the land and oceans by 2030. So it's like immediately in 8 years. Around like 70 countries are willing, to implement these programs, but indigenous people are not being part of the discussions, at least in the beginning. And one issue is about the protected areas and this approach of conservation, that indigenous people are expelled from their traditional ancestral territories, and they are not allowed to practice their livelihoods. And this is of concern for you too. And I would like to know, like, what is your view and also the position of the Permanent Forum, if it's possible, about this program that is eminent and the states are starting to providing insights and how to implement it. And also very related to the fact of the funding, how indigenous people get funding directly to preserve and protect their territory.
It is indigenous peoples are involved through the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, or not in the beginning, but have been involved in the negotiations, and they have managed to get something there. But as you said, the protected and conservation areas, they are let's say that obligation to create them is also contradicts the indigenous peoples living in those areas. And the Permanent Forum, we had conservation and protected areas as one of the themes of our expert group meeting. And we organized that in Nairobi in Kenya, and there we invited the indigenous peoples from African countries to tell about their examples about the protected areas and what influences they had to their cultures. And we heard numerous cases how the protected areas have been established without the free, prior and informed consent of the indigenous peoples, and what kind of devastating influences they had to the indigenous peoples. And we also heard about the court cases in Kenya, and then about the victory of Maasai indigenous peoples there, and the lack of the implementation of the court cases. And that is a serious problem, because in many cases that indigenous peoples there is legislation to protect them, but then the implementation of those cases is lacking. And what could be done when speaking about the protected and the conservation areas? First of all, it's the same as in quite many of the questions. It is that we have to. This sounds maybe a silly answer, but we have to distribute information about indigenous peoples. And in many cases, it's tourism companies and so on which take advantage of the areas, buy the areas, rent the areas from the government. And usually it is the international attention to the case which can then stop or slow it down and make the investors to pull out from that, creating those kind of protected conservation areas where the aim is to build this kind of area for tourism purpose. And in many cases, indigenous peoples, it helps that indigenous peoples start working start cooperating with so-called investors who invest sustainably. And we, for example, we have seen here in the Nordic countries that those investments were most successful, which were based on sustainable principles and human rights. And maybe one of the ways we could do is to use the investors and in all these different investment funds for our own purpose, to ask them to protect human rights, indigenous rights in their investments. And that's a huge task, but that's the responsibility of us, our responsibility, indigenous peoples living in these wealthy countries, that we should do that. And in many cases, it is the negative publicity for those companies which helps indigenous rights to be taken into account, because it is, after all, in this business world, it's about publicity and the image. So, but these what I'm now, these are the things which we have been using in our for example, in my home community, there was coming an international company wanted to establish diamond mine, and we launched a campaign against that mine internationally, and that helped the company to pull out. Of course, we took that case to the court as well. But then the question is, where do indigenous peoples get resources to do that? And there we need the global cooperation with each other, because it's a whole question about the solidarity. When the rights of indigenous peoples are recognized and strengthened in all parts of the world, then also our rights nationally are strengthened. So by the end of the day, by helping other indigenous peoples, we help ourselves.
Thank you, Anne. I wanna just to conclude the set of questions, because I would like to give the opportunity to people to ask you questions. And after hearing all of you, and for instance, you say like we go regularly to courts, and I've seen that the strategic litigation among indigenous people is one of the strengths when talking about activism and resistance among indigenous people. So I would like to ask you about the role of universities in legal education. So universities have like a huge responsibility in forming like the future lawyers. Let's talk only about law faculties. And with great surprise, when I came to Mcgill, I saw how the university is taking seriously the importance of indigenous legal tradition. And for a student of first year, that's one of the first classes that they attended. To me, it was like my changing, knowing that. And also because it was like a call for action, like 28, when after a long reconciliation process, one of the recommendations to university was that, to start including indigenous people's legal traditions within the curriculums. So I would like to ask you, what do you think is the role of universities and in indigenous and non-indigenous students in the importance to advance in the recognition of indigenous people's rights? And with that, I'm gonna stop myself and give the floor to you, and then open the session for questions.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think I salute all the universities who have in their curricula to teach about indigenous rights, because I think it's one of the musts for every lawyer in the world to know what means indigenous, what are the rights, and so on. And and when it comes to the courts, because quite a number of lawyers, they go to become prosecutors, work as judges, they have to know the basics. And we have seen that when there are, for example, in the Nordic countries, in Norway, when there is when Sami law is considered as one of the legal traditions, it means that there are more and more cases which are, how do you say, indigenous positive. I don't know if that's an English word say or so, but it means that indigenous peoples don't need to make complaints to the higher court, to the Supreme Courts and so on. So it helps us in many ways. And for example, when we look at the Nordic countries here, in Norwegian educational system and in court systems, this has gone the furthest. There, the Sami law is recognized as one of the as its own legal study, part of the legal studies. And in Finland, we are a little bit, since we are much less people, we haven't proceeded so far. And in Sweden, it's still work in progress. But I think it's a good, and what I have looked at the Canadian universities, it's really good that you are working with that one. And when at the Permanent Forum, we have this kind of informal network for universities who work with Indigenous rights. So, and it is important. And within the Permanent Forum, we have been discussing if we could establish working groups as other subsidiary bodies of the ECOSOC, and have informally discussed that maybe truth and reconciliation, implementation of peace accords would be one of the themes. But these are discussions within the Permanent Forum, how we could do, because we'd like to offer an arena to exchange information and so on for people outside the Permanent Forum, those for the experts. And these are our internal discussions that we'd like to see that somehow there is more steady permanent network for experts in these fields.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for your inspiring and very interesting insights. I would like now to open the floor to the participants and people who are connected that would like to ask directly to Anne some question. If you want, you can open your microphone, or you just type the questions in the chat. So the floor is yours. Hi, Patricia, thank you.
Hi, Luisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much, Anne, for your extensive explanation. My name is Patricia Villamayra-Genzano, and I am a professor of Latin American Studies at Georgetown University, but I have been working with Indigenous women's issue for a long time. One that is just a very short comment, because you have presented a wide variety of issues that affect Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women. I wanted just to say that I see a huge and very important comparison, and what you just mentioned at the very beginning, saying that you didn't, when Luisa asked you about when did you find out that you were Indigenous, and you mentioned the issue of education, and you mentioned the issue of having nowhere to send youth and children to the daycare. This is the same comparison of the same case that happens in Latin America. In my case, I work a lot with Bolivia, Peru, and the communities. So until we did not have a law like it was in 1994 in Bolivia with the adoption of the education reform in the main language, indigenous language, Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani, with the institution of the daycares in those languages. It was not a recognition of that the language is an anchor of your identity. And then that spread to the land, to the water, to food, and to many other issues. But it was a recognition at the national level, and it is 20 years after, 30 years after, that the country elects an indigenous president, regardless of the situations there. But it shows that education has to be the beginning of all these issues. And I hear you, and I just put a comparison in such a different areas, constellations and different views, but it's the same. Still, we are human, and the recognition of who we are, our language, our values, needs to be acknowledged at the national level, at the law, with the law. So it's just what I wanted to say, and I really thank you for bringing all these different issues that starts in that cornerstone, who we are, how we move. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. David?
Yes, hello, hi, and thank you for a really, really interesting, and I loved the kind of historical perspective that you brought. I work for the Rights and Resources Initiative, and we primarily work on land tenure rights. So I was really interested to hear how you talked about first rights are cultural rights, gaining recognition of Indigenous peoples, the right to be taught in your own language at school. And then, you know, after that sort of recognition, then there can be the struggle for land rights. One of the questions that we're wrestling with right now is, once communities have secure land tenure rights, what are the other enabling conditions that allow, you know, sort of the pursuit of self-determined economic and conservation goals? So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on, I know it's not a linear continuum, but after sort of land tenure rights, what are the next set of rights that you see Indigenous communities needing to struggle for? Thanks again.
Should I answer, Luisa?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, to still continue on these linguistic rights. Now our legislation in Finland is so that in all country of Finland, if the Sami child has Sami as a mother tongue, wait a second, I will tell to my daughter to stay a little bit more quiet. Speaking about children, yes, my daughter is on the phone. So that it doesn't matter where the child lives in Finland, she has a right to have a daycare in the Sami language, even though she's the only Sami in some corner in the Finnish town. So this is right, and the municipality town city has to organize the daycare. But when it comes to the school, going into the school in the Sami language, it's just in the Sami territory, Sami home rule region, so that the Sami kids can have their education in schools in the Sami language up from the 1st to 12th grade. So it's territorial right, this right to education in the Sami language. And when it comes to the, of course, I haven't been in this discussion. I am not speaking as a lawyer, starting from the right to self-determination, listing all the indigenous rights and so on. I have been speaking more like a person living in this, how do you experience? So that this hasn't been not any official talk in that sense. But when it comes to the, of course, the most important is right to self-determination, and it is up to our own, each of our own people. We define which we want to, how we want to be it to be organized. And for example, when it comes to the Sami world, we decided that we don't want to organize the healthcare of our own. We go into this the national healthcare. so that we have given part of our, according the self-determination, we decide which parts we want to be involved in the national society and in which not. And then there are those dispute issues. And here we don't have the land and tenure rights in Finland recognized, but in Norway the situation is different. There is a so-called Finnmark Act, which gives possibility for Sami and all the people living in Finnmark County, which is size of maybe Ontario, also Norwegians, right to apply the ownership to the land if they can show that they have been living in that land and managed that land, use that land for a certain time of the period. And then there is a commission who deals with the applicants, and there is a huge area where the whole municipality, the ownership of the whole municipality in the previous decision was given to the Sami living in that area. So they have to build now the governance and see how the land is managed. But of course, that decision is going to be appealed to the higher court. So it's the decision is not of the Land Rights Commission is not valid yet. But after the land and tenure rights, of course, it comes to the question, the social rights and how the people are. How is the well-being of the people? What is the mental well-being of the people? And I cannot personally group the rights, because first we look at our individually ourselves, and we have to feel that we are equally belonging to the society where we come from. And so our social rights are important. So we have the right to work and income and so on. But maybe this is not the question you are looking for. Maybe you are looking for different. This is not the answer you are looking for. So I would ask you to analyze your own society and look at. It's up to the society. What are the priorities? What are the living conditions there? And so how it could be organized. So not good answer, but counter question is the answer. Analyze the society, look the needs of the society and see what's wrong.
Thank you. And before moving to Prakash, Sanjay, I would like to acknowledge one a question in the chat, and it's like, what are your thoughts about the current political situation of indigenous peoples in Brazil regarding the demarcation of their traditional territories? It's by Jimena Viga.
Yes, that is something that within the permanent forum, we have organized bilateral meetings with the government of Brazil and inquired the situation. And we have expressed our concern about how the indigenous governance structures were abolished is not the right word, but were broken down, so that there isn't any more offices which are responsible. And we have also expressed our and asked in our bilateral meetings the government to explain the violence and so on. And we have given explanations, but since the permanent forum is not human rights body as such, so we can just express our concern and follow the situation. So that, and in one of our recommendations, we have asked one of the treaty bodies to establish a special procedure to analyze the situation in Brazil and give recommendations at the Human Rights Council side. So that was what we could do in that one. But of course, we have contacted the government in various cases and have have the ongoing discussion with them. But of course, this COVID-19 and the pandemics, that has, because we have not been able to have in-person meetings, to organize meetings with different governments, it has hindered our work greatly.
Thank you, Anne. Prakash, I'm sorry if I am mispronouncing your name. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Luisa. There's no mispronunciation. You have very rightly pronounced my name. And thank you for giving me a chance to say something or ask something or share something. First and foremost, I'm not a member of any indigenous community. I'm from India, in fact, from the central zone of India, the central province of India, which houses or is a home to many tribal communities. We call them tribal people here. That's the constitutional compulsion. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. My question is to Anne, because she is the current chairperson of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And in her talk, she did mention Asia and Africa. What I have seen here is, in India, that indigenous communities, which are, constitutionally out of that constitutional compulsion, whatever called tribal communities, they have become a kind of, a tool in the hands of, or some kind of machine in the hands of the politics of the country, and it has been going on for decades, in fact. So indigenous peoples here in India, the tribals, are hardly made aware of the value of their own traditional cultural systems, belief systems, mythologies, legends and lores, etc. And instead, they are lured by the so-called, reservation schemes, government job reservations, etc. And then there is another kind of, luring away for these indigenous people. They are the missionaries who have worked in the northeast of India, and then they are currently working in these central provinces of India, taking people away again from their traditional cultures and belief systems and converting them, giving them a different identity, which certainly they cannot relate to, will never ever be able to relate to. Can they in some way do something about it? And naturally, there are any in these parts of the world, like in India, for example, they have to approach the UN, or the UN can do something in a proactive manner. This is my question to Anne.
Thank you for your question. It is the UN, it has its resident coordinator in India, in all the developing countries. And under the resident coordinator are located all the UN agencies, specialized agencies, which work in for example, in India. And one of the possibilities for indigenous peoples is to contact the resident coordinator's office and ask them what could different UN agencies do in this context. I'm not sure if they will answer anything about the missionaries, but when it comes to the indigenous rights, and that's a different area. And we have when there was a reform of the United Nations, and all these resident coordinators, they report to DESA, and then we have asked this reporting system also to include indigenous peoples and their situation in the country in question. And there are countries reporting in a different manner, and and in some reports, there is a very thorough analysis. What is the situation of indigenous peoples and what the UN agencies could direct their work in those according to try to solve the issues. But by the end of the day, it's always the will of the government what happens. But that is one of the options. But then the easier option is to report to the treaty bodies, to the Office of the High Commissioner, to different treaty bodies if there are breaches of different human rights conventions. That's the other option.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for this forum. Really appreciate it. And I've been in Inari, the capital of the Sami people in Finland, if I'm not mistaken. So beautiful to be that part of the world. My question is, I am focused on food sovereignty and equity in the Native American lands. I am myself non-native, so I talk about the UN RIP and the first prior informed consent. Yet many people don't know about it. In the context of US and generally in America, the focus is so much on state rights, tribal rights, and federal, that what has been mandated at the UN level never get brought to the tribal level, and people are not even aware of their own rights in the context of what has been mandated and signed up by many countries. So I'm curious about what is being done, if anything, to get the message out to a wider audience, especially in US. I'm not sure what the situation is in Canada, but I'm assuming in more developed countries, there may be similar issues. And also, if you have any thoughts about food sovereignty and equity, I would appreciate that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And food sovereignty, and this is something Luisa knows very well. She has been working. There was this UN Food System Summit took place last September in New York. And as a result of that summit, there was established this Indigenous Peoples Coalition for Indigenous Peoples Food Systems. And there were 7 member states who established that, and we hope Canada was among those. And we also are hoping that, or I'm not sure if the United States has already joined to the coalition, but possibly will. And the coalition, it hasn't really started its work. It's going to be one addition to this these indigenous mechanisms, because indigenous peoples will have are going to be part of the governance or governance body of the coalition, and so that there are representatives of all 7 sociocultural regions. And one of the goals of this coalition is to recognize, respect, enhance the situation of indigenous people's food systems. And of course, because it's indigenous people's food systems, it also is linked to the self-determination. And therefore, one of the issues it will be working with is the land tender rights in this Rome-based agencies system, and possibly at the FAO. And one of what we have been discussing when establishing this coalition is that we try to get these kind of voluntary guidelines on indigenous people's food systems to be discussed at the FAO, but it's still to be seen what happens. And of course, it is the National Congress of American Indians works with, they have quite a number of different food system projects, initiatives, and programs, policies. And also, if I have understand, in Canada, there are also AFN works with these issues, so that both those are, all indigenous organizations are invited to the work, and also universities, all interested parties are invited to work with this coalition. So it's an open invitation to the work, and there each can define what kind of work they want to do.
Thank you, and we want to close the dialogue and with the question in the chat from Ivrash. The Koshi indigenous people living in Pakistan, Afghanistan regions face difficulties in cross-border and seasonal migrations. Has such issues been discussed at the Permanent Forum, and how will these issues be brought to the international forums?
Thank you for the question. This is something the Sami we are facing every day since we live in 4 different countries, and our reindeer migrate from one state to another. That's between Sweden and Norway. And so we have been discussing within the Permanent Forum that could immigration and these peoples who live in, or people who live, indigenous people who live in many countries, could this be as one of the topics, but it hasn't been decided yet. This is something that I think that it's going to happen in the future, because there are quite many indigenous peoples residing in multiple countries and then facing different issues, problems, so that this is something future topics to be discussed and proposed to the Permanent Forum and also to EMRI.
Okay, thank you so much. We are closing the dialogue on the first section of Indigenous Peoples and Global Challenges with a great insight from Anne Nuorgam, the president of the Permanent Forum, UN Permanent Forum Indigenous Issues. And thank you so much for coming and for giving us all your insights, being so inspiring, and it's admirable the work you have done in your community, but also at a global level. And we are very, very grateful to have you in our first event. I hope these kind of dialogues continue and having very interesting people bringing some ideas about the challenges, but also the resilience of indigenous peoples. And thank you so much to all of you for connecting. I am amazed by all people connecting from all part of the world. Thank you so much. And we're gonna continue sending you invitation for future dialogues. Thank you so much to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Luisa.
Thanks a lot, and congratulations. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Mariana.
And welcome to follow the Permanent
Ciao,
Forum.
Mika.
Starts 25.
Sorry, Anne.
Welcome to join to the meeting of the Permanent Forum. It starts on 25th of April. See you there.
It's gonna be in person?
We hope so.
And is
But
it possible to go?
We don't know yet.
Okay, if it's possible to go in person, I would like to go. I'm very close, so it's like easy. Okay, thank you so much. Ciao, Mika. Ciao, Mariana.
Congratulations so much, Annie. So great to listen.
Thank you, Mika, for joining.
My pleasure. It's great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Could end the recording, Luisa?
Yep, I'm gonna.